So reports emerged this week from Bloomberg that a major analyst in Japan who specializes in examining the supply chain for displays, they're making the claim that Nintendo's next generation console is going to have an 8-inch display. There have been previous reports that there'll be an 8-inch 1080p display. So we seem to be seeing some sort of, sort of agreement between very different sources here that is what's going to happen. We can't confirm that. We don't know that in the here and now. But what we do know is that the concept of having an 8-inch display on a handheld machine could have profound implications on the expectation levels that we should set for the machine. So let me explain here, right? So here we have the Switch OLED, which is the machine that has the largest display in the current Switch lineup, right? That's a 7-inch display, 7-inch OLED display. And when we're talking about 8-inch, we've got the PlayStation Portal. There it is. And it's basically, we're looking at a vastly, larger display there, which means a vastly larger handheld. I mean, maybe not as hulking as this beast. And in turn, you've got to ask yourself questions like, well, is this actually going to be a Switch 2 if, your Joy-Cons aren't going to be able to attach to it? Because that would be a bit of a struggle. And, it just wouldn't look right. It would be a bit weird. Lots of questions that are being raised in the wake of this news. John, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think if they're going for that large size, my best guess would be that they have sort of accepted the fact that this is going to be a larger machine than the original Switch. And based on the rumored specs and what we've been hearing about it, I would expect that the chip powering it, the SoC, is not going to be an especially small package.
Yeah.
And thus, between that and the battery life considerations, I would imagine that they're going to find every way to increase the amount of internal real estate. And increasing the screen size is a great way to do that, because the consumer can enjoy the bigger size, but it automatically means your device has to be bigger, and now there's more interior space. And I think at this point we've reached a point where people are somewhat more accepting of larger handhelds again. We're in the post iPad tablet world, and things like Steam Deck and everything have taken off and have become very successful. Maybe not Nintendo level kind of mass market success, but I genuinely think people will be more accepting of a big machine. And I would not be surprised to see the Joy-Con removed entirely and replaced with onboard controls.
Right.
I think the Joy-Con concept was neat. It kind of worked, but in practice, I suspect that people weren't switching between them that often, and it ultimately just made the machine feel somewhat flimsier. It was another point of failure. When holding it, it always had a little bit of a wiggle to it, just a little bit, just enough where you're like, this doesn't feel great in the hands. And I never use the Joy-Con really. When I dock it, I just use a Pro controller, so I wouldn't mind that either.
But that is a peripheral, right? Which kind of suggests that if you can't remove your controller from Switch 2, they would have to include a separate
They would have
controller.
to include it in the box. I agree, which adds to the expense, of course. So that is an interesting shift, and I'll be curious to see what they do with that. But yeah, it's that. You remember those weird rumors though about the double screen thing?
Right.
I wonder what's going on here. There's so much we just don't know about this machine right now and what they're trying to do. And even the name Switch, we've been calling it the Switch 2, but when you remove the Joy-Con, I mean, technically you can still dock or undock, but it kind of takes part of the meaning of the Switch name away from it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, which also, I'm very curious to see what's going to become of this hardware. And I hope that they do reveal this somewhat soon. I feel like if they're going to launch it this year, we're going to have to hear about it in the next few months.
I mean, I think that the idea of a bigger Switch, it does feel like a natural evolution, because if you go from the original Switch that had a 6.2-inch LCD, then you go to the OLED, which has a 7-inch OLED display, the magnitude of an increase in the size of the display is pretty similar to that, you know, 0.8 inches versus 1 inch. It makes a lot of sense, especially if you're looking at some of these Windows devices that people tend to like, and they might have 7-inch screens, but they have very large controls attached, or like the, you know, PlayStation Portal size device as well. So I think the Switch 2 yes, exactly, the 7.4 inch OLED Steam Deck, of course. I think that the Switch 2 probably would have pretty reasonable dimensions in that context, even if they go with a larger display, because the controls will probably be comparatively quite a bit smaller. I know people are upset about the LCD thing, and I kind of think that this to me feels like classic Nintendo and very natural, and I wasn't expecting an OLED device. I hope that
it is so
yeah,
Nintendo,
it's very Nintendo. And also, like, if you look at the production cost of an OLED screen, it's only like 25 or 30% more than a comparable LCD, so it's not even like that much of a cost savings.
Yeah, but if everything else about the machine is that expensive and they have to bundle in a controller, I can see why they would want to cut those costs.
And also, I hope that this would set them up for maybe a supercharged OLED model in maybe 2 years or something that maybe has HDR support or something else that's exciting.
See,
right.
But I was hoping for HDR support out of the game, because I feel like the Switch, this concept would be perfect for that, because if you're HDR on the go, everybody can experience the games in HDR.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also just think that people should understand historically, like I played a lot on earlier Nintendo handhelds like the DS, the 3DS, the Wii U, which was a handheld sort of technically, right? And those like TN LCDs, well, in the 3DS, it depended on what panel you got from the panel lottery, but like it could be a TN LCD. Those were like really horrible panels in retrospect. So I think even like a sort of semi-decent IPS panel on the Switch 2 before being upgraded to an OLED a couple of years later, it's not the worst thing in the world, especially for like really bright games that don't depend on having really deep dark contrast. There are those titles like Metroid Prime 2, or like a future Metroid Prime, or like a Luigi's Mansion, but most games like Mario Karts will probably still look pretty decent on an LCD.
I just hope it's a decent LCD, right? Because the LCD in the original Switch and the original Steam Deck, for that matter, they're garbage tier. They don't look good. Games actually, it feels like the hardware got more of an upgrade internally just because of the screen. Like it makes that big of a difference. So...
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, this is all really interesting. I mean, the concept of having an 8-inch screen does mean a larger device, and that kind of makes sense if what we're hearing about the Switch processor, the new SoC, the new Tegra is true, that it's an 8-nanometer chip, which is going to be quite large, but also quite cheap for Nintendo to buy, which would make sense. That's exactly what happened with Tegra X1 on the original Switch. Old process... therefore cheap to buy, cheap to make, cheap to buy. And therefore, if you've got a larger chip that needs better cooling, then you have a larger device. How do you make that device work from an ergonomic perspective, from an aesthetic perspective? Well, you put a bigger screen on it. Kind of all sort of starts to come together. Maybe we're going to get this completely wrong. The concept of having detachable Joy-Cons, I mean, we're not ruling it out by any means. It's just they would be like Joy-Con 2s, Super Joy-Con or whatever. They'd be very different configuration because the casing has necessarily got to be quite different. I mean, if you look at the Switch here, the Joy-Con is basically flush with the depth of the machine there. If the new machine is deeper, how are these things going to attach? I don't think there could be any sort of level of compatibility there.
Maybe wireless compatibility?
Wireless, possibly, yeah, right? I guess that would make sense. I guess also the question is, the whole Switch concept becomes something quite different then, doesn't it? The concept of having to bundle in a separate controller because you
Rich, do you have your Steam Deck OLED there, by the way, handy?
No, I don't. I have the standard one.
Picking up the Steam Deck and then the Switch OLED, I had this impression that the Switch OLED was heavier somehow.
No, I don't think so.
Like it genuinely felt... It felt like, I think it's because it has that sort of metal body on it, and there's something about it that made it feel like chunkier somehow,
right?
Despite being smaller. So I haven't looked at the official measurements, so I was curious about that.
There's such an air of mystery around the next generation Switch at the moment. I'm surprised there haven't been more leaks, to be honest. Maybe Nintendo's sort of playing it safe with the design of the development kit. it might not be anything like final hardware. Might just be an anonymous looking black box for all we know.
What if they do a retro Switch that uses a CRT with like big old cast iron rails on the side for putting your Joy-Cons on, just to hold the weight?
Man,
you put the battery in your pocket like the Vision Pro.
That's quite a flight of fancy, though. I guess, I hope to see something new soon, and something that puts an end to all of the speculation. I do remember, prior to the launch of prior to the reveal of the original Switch 1, it was, all bets were off. There was crazy talk. There was people saying it's going to be a high-end AMD device. We had pretty good sourcing that it was going to be using Tegra X1, or maybe some variant thereof, which turned out to be broadly accurate. But man, things are sort of really ratcheting up to the max at the moment. I just want some answers at this point. I think we can safely assume it's going to be an NVIDIA Tegra in there, but that's pretty much it. Form factor, and I think the thing that, going back to the original reveal trailer, it was all about the everyday use of the device. What set this apart from a standard home console. They showed all of the potential use case scenarios. I would love to see a rerun of that, just to show us what this device is actually envisaged as, and, whether there is going to be any kind of continuity with the original Switch 1. I think there'll be backwards compatibility. I think that's pretty much a given at this point. But, how does this device actually work? I think there's fantastic potential, but I'll just have to wait and see. In the meantime, it does look as though we're getting an 8-inch LCD display. Sorry, John.